Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be a continuation of the lecture on the Jackson administration. And this time we are going to focus on what's happening with Native Americans during the Jackson administration. Now, to be able to do this, we're going to have to go back in time a little bit, and we're going to give a brief overview of kind of the situation that Native Americans are in from the time that European settlers arrive in America all the way through the War of 1812, and kind of just to give you some context for why Native Americans are vulnerable for the removal policy that Jackson is going to come up with. So what's the background? Well, the Plains Indians, Native Americans, all throughout, the Americas they've been brutalized. They've been essentially dealing with invasion for right around 250 years by the time we get to Jackson. And so we know when the Spanish came here, the Indians of the Native Americans of the Southwest are being brutalized by them. There's all kinds of rampant disease, smallpox being the absolute worst, which is, in some estimates, killing like 9 out of 10 Native Americans. I mean, they're just being absolutely brutalized by this disease. But they've also been fighting the French, the British, and the Americans. And so, this has, because 250 years of fighting has happened, the natives are starting to become exhausted. They don't have as many braves to be able to keep up the fight. It's just been very, very tough. The natives have been mistreated legally as well, by having their treaties constantly being violated. One thing that we see happens is, for the most part, the natives, at least initially, this will change later on, but initially, natives tended to keep the terms of the treaty. And so they would follow the rules. And it was the settlers that didn't. And so, and the American government essentially allow that to happen. And it's not just the American government, the British government and the French government as well. The French of the three probably have the best relationship with the Native Americans. The French in the Americas aren't as interested in, manufacturing and farming. They're more in the Americas for the fur trade. And so the French that are roaming around in the plains typically view natives as their allies. Their guides to help them hunt and collect beaver pellets and stuff like that are wildly valuable back in Europe. But the natives are constantly having their treaties broken by, very specifically the British and the Americans. One of the problems with the concept of these treaties and these treaty violations is that, at least initially in the very beginning, natives didn't understand the concept of a treaty. Right? We've got two different civilizations. This doesn't mean that Native Americans weren't intelligent. Of course they were, but they just had a different system of government. They had different views on how to use land, and they had different ideas about ownership. And so, if from a European perspective, land is all about private ownership. You need to own the land. You need to, once you own it, it is yours, and no one else can use it unless you allow them to. And then it's your job to improve upon the land, and that it very specifically means build a house, build a business, build a farm, do one of those things. And if you're not doing that, you're not using the land properly. Right? Native Americans, they believe in more of a communal ownership. And so they did have territory. And if other rival tribes tried to invade their territory, there could be conflict there. And we know that the natives fought each other over land. But in general, the idea was that the land was kind of there for everybody to use, and nobody could really own the land. It's more that the people belong to the land than the land belonged to the people. And so when these European settlers came into the Americas and said, "Hey, sign this piece of paper, and we'll give you some guns, some horses, some food, some trinkets, whiskey, whatever, and so we can use this land." They didn't think when they were signing those initial treaties that that meant that they would never be able to use the land again. They just kind of thought it would be okay, you'll use it, we'll use it, it'll be, whatever. But then all of a sudden, farms and towns pop up, which are completely foreign to them. And that becomes an issue. Now, what's interesting about that too is when I say like these towns pop up and that's completely foreign to them. That's really actually not the case. We think of today as Native Americans being nomadic before the reservation system, anyway. But that's really wasn't the case until the Spanish showed up. Most Native Americans originally, their tribes, they had towns and villages. I live in southern Illinois, right next to Cahokia Mountains, which is one of the greatest Native American civilizations of its time, or the greatest civilizations of its time, right? It's when the Spanish brought horses that the natives were then able to very easily follow the bison. And as they followed the bison, they became more nomadic, which made them more foreign to the European settlers, and kind of evolved this idea of communal land usage. Well, we're going to follow the bison. And so if you're going to stick around while we're gone, you want to use the land, fine. When we get back, we'll use it. Everything will be good. But when, they come back and all of a sudden there's settlers there in villages and they're saying, no, we bought this land, get away. The natives don't quite get that. They'll get it eventually. And so these cultural differences are going to lead to conflict. And this is going to be devastating for natives, because when two cultures come into conflict, generally the technologically superior culture is going to win, and the technologically inferior culture stands a good chance of getting wiped out. At least that's what history tells us. It's not a good thing. It's a really ugly. And so, because the in Native Americans, particularly the Plains Indians, tend to be more nomadic, that causes some of that tension. And again, remember, that's really interesting because that's in large part because Europeans made them that way when they brought horses to the Americas. The horses weren't originally in North America. It's the Spanish brought them from Europe. So the other thing that the Spanish bringing horses to the Americas is going to do, it's not just going to make the Native Americans more nomadic. It's also going to make a lot of these tribes completely dependent on bison. And so what you see here is a chart of the everything that Native Americans would use bison for, and they used every part of it. And so they'd use the horns for cups or spoons, containers. Excuse me. They'd obviously eat the meat. They'd use ribs for arrow shafts. They'd use the stomach, because stomach acid is real tough. It could be used for like water containers, cooking pots. Boil the hooves for glue. They'd use the cow manure, the dung, for campfires to cook on. Remember, the Midwest didn't look back then like it does today, because the prairie grass, the root structure was so thick, there just weren't very many trees. If you wanted to cook your food, you didn't really have wood. There's more trees in the Midwest today than any point in history. And so today you would just say, well, you want a fire, cut down a tree, burn it. Well, there weren't really a lot of trees back on the Great Plains back then. And so if you wanted to cook something, you had to take the cow manure, let it dry out so it wasn't real stinky, and then light it, and that's how you cook your food. They'd use the tail for fly swatters. They'd use the bones for tools. They'd use the hide for clothes or tents. And so, use the brains to cure the ends of the skin of the hides. They really used all of it. And this is going to make Native Americans dependent upon the bison, which is, before European settlers got to North America, there were millions and millions of bison roaming the plains. And so being dependent on them is not that big of a deal. But after America gains its independence and we start to settle the West for many reasons that we'll talk about here in a minute, we start to eradicate the bison, which is another thing that's going to weaken the Native American population. Not only are their braves worn out from the French and Indian Wars, from the War of Independence, and then later the War of 1812 and the Black Hawk War and all these different wars, they're also being worn out from disease like smallpox, and then they're also being worn out from a lack of food because the bison are all but going to disappear. And so that will essentially starve the Native Americans. So when the bison start to get killed off, Native Americans are going to really struggle to survive. We're going to see that the Americans after the War for Independence and the United States is its own country. We're going to see that the bison are going to be killed for a number of reasons. And it's not necessarily to deprive the natives of food. I'm sure some people thought that, but that's a minority of people. Most people want to kill them for really practical reasons. There's millions of them roaming the plains, and there's the growing cattle industry. The bison come through in these herds of hundreds of thousands of bison. They're just gigantic. They trample all the ground. They chase off the cattle, so the cattle can't really use the same land that the bison are using. If you're a farmer out there and one of these herds comes through and you're growing corn or wheat or whatever it is, the bison will either eat it all or trample it all and destroy it. And so you can't really build a fence back then practical enough to keep the bison out. And so the farmers wanted them dead. The cattle ranchers wanted them dead. And also once we start to build railroads and start to connect our country with railroads and eventually the Transcontinental Railroad, the railroad companies need to see the bison gone too, because these herds, these herds are hundreds of thousands of bison deep. And what happens when they decide to just, run across a train track? If a train hits a herd that deep, if it hits one, maybe it just splats the bison. And then it's over. But maybe it derails the train. And if it hits, hundreds of them, it's probably going to derail the train. And so if we're going to connect our country, which we're going to need economically, we're just not going to be able to have these bison. We're also going to see that they're killed for sport. Buffalo Bill is going to become famous. He's going to set a record for the most bison killed in an hour. Kansas, to be able to get rid of the bison population there for farmers and for cattle ranchers. Kansas is a real cattle state. They want the bison gone. They're going to have contests where they're going to pay people, pay money prizes for who can kill the most bison in a day. And, literally hundreds of people show up, kill thousands of bison in a day. We even know the railroad companies, they're going to be killing the bison and they're going to use that as food to feed their employees. But we also know that they're going to put on the back of some of their trains, Gatling guns, which are like machine, they're the earlier version of machine guns. You turn the crank and just round after round fires out. They're going to pull up next to these herds and they're going to sell tickets. And you can literally take one of these Gatling guns up to the side of a herd and then just mow them down and literally kill thousands of them. Sometimes people will come in and take the hides because you can sell the hides for money, but a lot of times they'll just take the hide and let everything else rot. And so like Native Americans will come on to the scene and see thousands of buffalo dead in the field and just their hides are gone, and they're just going to think it's tragic because they live in this, they're dependent on the bison, and so they view it as a waste and it's dangerous for them. But they also they understand that there should be a balance. You only take what you need, and we're definitely not doing that. And so that we're trying to make room for the cattle, but that's putting increased pressure on natives. They're finding that their food source is quickly running out. By 1883, we had about 100 million bison roaming the plains. 100 million bison. By 1883, we're only going to have about 200 left. I mean that's crazy. We just wiped them out super quick, and luckily enough, the some of them are going to survive. Later through the national park system, and Teddy Roosevelt with his trying to reforest those efforts. We're going to see that we're going to be able to build the bison population back up. One thing to note, in the notes here, I have them called buffalo, and that's what we tend to call them. That's not actually correct. They are bison. There are no buffalo in North America except in zoos. Water buffalo, they're native to Africa. Bison are what roam our plains, and so that is the technical term. I'm sorry that I have that up there. I've been meaning to change that for years, but life is what life. So now the Americans are more and more thinking of the Native Americans as a problem that need to be solved. We continue to press up against Native American territory, and as we do that, tensions start to increase. The natives recognize that we are, as the two societies get closer and closer together, even if there's a defined boundary, a lot of those settlers look over at native land and they see like there's not a farm on that plot of land over there. And if there's not a farm on that plot of land over there, I'm going to go build a farm over there and I'll make more money and that'll make my family, wealthier. Or it could be that I have a farm next to native territory. I've got two sons. One's going to inherit my farm. The other's looking for a place to go and he sees some empty land over there that is supposed to be owned by the natives, and they run over and squat in that territory. And so and as they do that, the natives don't like that, and so tensions rise. The militia ends up getting called out. We see fighting. We ultimately win because the natives just aren't strong enough to stand up to our military. When that happens, we force them to sign a new treaty. We push them further west. We take that new set of land, we fill it with settlers, and as we fill it with settlers, the same thing happens, right? We start to look at their new land, and we want that too. And so the idea is we got to figure out a way to deal with these Native Americans. One approach is assimilation. That's not going to last long. Guys like George Washington really kind of promoted assimilation. They just said, hey, this is democracy. Just be American, learn English, convert to Christianity, farm, do those things. Some Native Americans will do that, and some Native Americans will have success doing that individually, but it's not successful on any large scale. The Cherokee are a good example of that. They try very hard. They learn English. They write their own constitution. They're democratic. They become farmers. They so assimilate, right? The Cherokee are mostly down in like the Georgia region. They assimilate so well that they're in the South. They end up owning slaves. I mean, like, it's they're very, very educated, and still we're going to see that we're going to kick them off their land, and so we're not really going to allow the natives to assimilate. Eventually, by the time we get to Jackson is going to look around and he's going to say assimilation won't work. He's been fighting Native Americans in Tennessee for a while. He actually, in a perverse way, respects Native Americans, although he's been fighting them and killing them. He's massacred some of their villages. It's like, bad stuff, but he respects them as a warrior people, right? One warrior to another, and he says, look, there's sometimes where Native Americans are my enemy, but like kind of like samurai culture, but I can respect my enemy when they're brave and when they fight honorably and when they do these things. And so what Jackson ends up saying is, look, every time these two cultures come into conflict, violence ensues, and we're just not going to be able to to get along if we're living in proximity. And so he's going to really push for removal policy, which means not just like, hey, move a little bit further to the west. I mean, it means pick up and move to the far extremes of the west, which, a lot of that area, and one of the places he's going to push Native Americans is out to Oklahoma. That's, there's some land out there that's just, it's super hard to farm. It's totally foreign. The natives aren't from there. They don't know how to hunt. They don't understand what's going on out there. They don't know how to necessarily survive out there. It's just bad land. And so it's not a place where you want to go. Plus, with removal policy, they're not just removing, okay, Cherokee, you're going to go to Oklahoma, and the Sioux, you're going to go out to Arizona. No, I mean, they're all getting jammed in one tight area. And a lot of these tribes, this is the problem with thinking along racial lines that all racial groups are the same, right? Well, they're not. These tribes don't, just because they're Native American, it doesn't mean they're all the same. It doesn't mean they all like each other. It doesn't mean they all live the same way or have the same values. Some of these tribes hate each other and have historic rivalries that have led to war, and we're just going to essentially take them all, pick them up, and drop them off in the same spot. And it's going to be violent, and which is the fact that the Department of War is going to be in charge of removal policy is a good indication that it is going to be a pretty harsh thing that happens. And so the Department of the Interior, according to removal policy, will put these Native Americans on reservations. They're going to give them some autonomy there, but they're going to be told they have to stay on that reservation. And if they leave that reservation, there can be trouble. Like I said, that land's not going to be very good. Some of that land, we're going to like dump them out in like areas where we think, oh, that's like, that land's not that great. But then later we'll find gold on that land. And then guess what? We'll find a way to get that land back. And so through violating treaties, which we'll see in the 1960s, the United States Supreme Court will say, oops, we did bad, and try and give a lot of that land back. We're not going to be able to give it all back, clearly, and we're going to pay some of these tribes for the way that we violate these treaties. So by the 1960s, we're trying to make it better, but it's just not going to be it's not going to be enough. The War Department, essentially, if natives refuse to go, the War Department would just come in and forcefully remove them and take that disputed territory. And so the Native Americans aren't going to be given a whole lot of options there. So, like I said before, Washington through John Quincy Adams kind of really favored assimilation for the natives. But by Jackson's time, most Americans thought that this just wasn't going to be possible. They thought natives couldn't be civilized. That's obviously crazy. And essentially just said, not only do you have to go, but you have to go to the extreme far west, to land they believed that we were never going to want. But later when we talk in later lectures about manifest destiny, clearly, we're going to want to go coast to coast. And so they're going to, it doesn't matter how far we move them out west, we're still going to have issues there. So, which Jackson passed? With Native Americans, like I said before, he has a long history of fighting natives. He lives in Tennessee. That there's been issues with natives there. He's the guy that led the essentially attacked the Seminole in Florida. And so, the deal with Florida is, Florida was controlled by the Spanish, who were not as concerned about natives as the British and the Americans are. And the Spanish essentially were allowing the Seminole to use the land in Florida to stage raids and attacks into the southern states in the United States. Florida wasn't ours yet. It wasn't a part of America yet. And so the Seminole and escaped blacks from the South would raid into the United States, attacking a lot of these plantations and raiding, and then they'd race back to Florida, where they'd hide in the swamp and where the American military wouldn't go because Spain controlled Florida. And if we followed the Seminole and these free blacks into the swamps into Florida, that could be a cause for war with the Spanish. And so, we just didn't want to do that until Jackson got put in charge. When Jackson got put in charge, he was told to squash the Seminole Rebellion. And that's what he intended to do. And so he took his force down to the region above Florida. When the Seminole attacked, he followed them into Florida and not caring what the Spanish thought, and crushed the Seminole and crushed the resistance. Kind of becomes an American hero for that, because the Seminole were attacking Americans, for obvious reasons they were attacking Americans. But he becomes a hero, but he doesn't really stop there. He goes after the Spanish as well, and essentially is going to be able to chase the Spanish out of Florida, which will lay the groundwork for later Florida joining the Union. So, has this long history. He will, in fact, actually adopt a Native American son. He, kind of takes pity on the son, raises him by every indication, loves him. It's that weird, perverse thing where, he spends his time fighting the natives. He's going to push removal policy, which, by the way, the removal policy in Jackson's mind, he believes he's saving native culture. He believes he's doing a good thing. He thinks, like, look, I can't keep these American settlers from continuing to take your land and, causing conflict. And when there's conflict, the military is going to come in and you're going to lose. He thinks he's saving natives by taking them and moving them west so that conflict doesn't happen. So, it's weird, it's perverse, just like the idea that he kills all these Native Americans in war, but he adopts one of them as a son, and really, by all indications, is, like, cares about him, treats him well. So Jackson did not support assimilation, didn't think it was possible, did not want to see Native Americans wiped out. He thought the only way to save Native American culture, which is a culture that he respected, was to remove them. But when I say he respected, I mean, like, it's a weird, perverse kind of respect. So don't think, he's like this kind-hearted, lover of Native Americans. So that's not the case. He's a hard man, and the natives he views as enemies of the United States, but he doesn't want to see them completely wiped off the map. And so the idea of reservations or anything close to the American states, he just realized that would take way too many U.S. troops to make sure that the natives stay on their land. It's just not practical. So they'd have to go far west. And so by 1830, he's going to pass the Indian Removal Act. And the Indian Removal Act essentially is going to provide federal funds to negotiate to get Native Americans to move out west. Now, this is that we're going to negotiate to buy this land, but don't think that we're paying a fair price for it, because that's not really the way it works. We are going to pay money for it, but it's going to be not anywhere near what the land is actually worth. Because basically the negotiations go like this. You're going to sign this treaty one way or another. You're either going to take the money that we offer you now, which is not what your land is worth, or you choose not to take it. The military will come in and force you out, and then you won't get anything at all. And so many tribes by this point, they're just like, well, we can't fight anymore. We just don't have the strength to do it. And they're going to take the initial money. Because they feel like if they hold out longer, that amount of money will get less and less and less, and eventually they might not get anything. And then if they, try not to go and try and fight, they might get wiped out completely, and the survivors would have to leave anyway and get nothing. And so many of the Native Americans will just take the money and go, even though it's not enough, and they'll be moved out west. The ones that go early get a little bit more money, and they most of them are going to have an easier time traveling out west, because they're going to, there's a date by the time that everybody has to go out. It's like 2 years. So they have like 2 years to move their stuff, and they're going to be able to go on their own. And it's not going to be like this forced march. It's not the Trail of Tears. The ones that stay late and that are forcefully removed, they're the ones that are going to be moved at gunpoint. It's the United States military that's going to come with guns and force them to leave. They're going to leave at a bad time of the year, have to go through bad weather, and it's going to be very, very deadly for those natives. So we're going to see about 90 treaties signed, and natives are going to be moving west. Again, Jackson thinks this is generous, but I think with hindsight we recognize that it's not. Most of these Native Americans are being sent to the Oklahoma, Arkansas kind of region, and so that's where they're going to be headed. Not necessarily the best land ever, but I guess it's better than being killed in a war. Still not good. All right, so that leads us to the Black Hawk War. And the Black Hawk War is 1832, and that's going to happen in the Illinois region. And so we're going to see in 32 the Sauk and the Fox Indians in Illinois are, they living in Illinois. They've been removed and told to go across the river into land into Missouri. The problem is when the Fox leave and they head over into Missouri, there are other tribes that historically own that land. And that land that they're in, they're not able to really farm it. They're really struggling and they're dying because every time they try and set up a farm or some sort of home base, other Native American tribes attack them and say, "Hey, get out of here! Land is scarce, and you don't belong here. You belong on the other side of the river, and you go." And so what'll happen is the Fox are going to sneak back over the river and try and plant some grain on their own old farmland. And when they do that, the militia is going to be called out. And so Chief Black Hawk is the guy that's organizing this. This is why it's known as the Black Hawk War. And so Black Hawk is organizing it. He's going to say that the original treaty that gave up the land in Illinois is not valid, that the Americans got the chief that signed the treaty drunk when he signed it. And so he says it's not valid anyway. That actually happens quite a bit. The other thing that happens with these treaties that's bogus is what we don't understand. We think that the chief of a tribe, that there's one chief and that chief is in charge of everything. Well, in a lot of tribes, that doesn't work that way. There's lots of chiefs. And so different chiefs in charge of different things. And sometimes it's a council that decides. And, each tribe is different. This, again, it's like when we judge it, and say all one race is the same. That's clearly categorically not true. And so, each tribe has their own kind of system, but most of them have many chiefs. And so what, the Americans would do is they'd go to one chief and say, sign this treaty for your land. We'll give you X amount of money, whiskey, guns, whatever, horses. And that chief would say no. And then they go to the next chief and say, well, we'll give you this amount of guns, weapon, whiskey, whatever, if you sign land. And that guy would say no. And then they go to the next chief. And so they found a chief that would sign it. Right. And then they would say, well, that chief signed for everybody. He's your leader. You all got to go. Well, I mean, if there's 7 chiefs in a tribe and 6 of them say no and 1 of them say yes, well, what does the tribe want? Right. They don't want to sign that treaty. But doesn't matter. Well, we now have the legal argument. So the Americans think they have the legal argument, so they got to go. Chief Black Hawk points out that this is crazy. This shouldn't bind my people. And so he goes back. He thinks that he's going to have other Native American support that's going to come out and help him. And the Illinois militia shows up and essentially slaughters Black Hawk and his troops. He doesn't get the help that he thought he was going to get. Black Hawk actually will try to surrender, but the settlers and the militia will essentially just slaughter him. About 70 settlers die and about 600 Native Americans die. And so all of this is happening, while the removal policy is going on. So that leads us to the Cherokee. And so the Cherokee, there's going to be a couple court cases involving the Cherokee. The Cherokee are a very unique group of Native Americans when talking about removal, because many tribes, you see with the Fox and you see Black Hawk, he's going to try and resist through war. Tecumseh tried to resist through war. Other tribes capitulated; they just gave in and left and headed out west. The Cherokee are going to be different. The Cherokee are going to be living in primarily Georgia, and they're going to challenge removal policy through the legal system. And so the Cherokee in Georgia did everything that Jefferson had asked them to do, that Washington before him had asked them to do, which is to assimilate. They decided to, write their own constitution. They became farmers. We've talked about this before. They speak English. They have their kids go to a, European style school, and they have done all that. They feel like they should be their own, their requirements to form their own state. They should have their own government, and they tried to do that. Georgia refuses to acknowledge this and opens up a portion of land to settlement. Now, there are, and again, because a lot of times we again, monolithic groups, and we try and say like, oh, all the Americans are against the Native Americans. No, there's not. There are several Southerners, particularly preachers, that are trying to help the Cherokee. They're, these white preachers are going into Cherokee land. They're helping organize the Cherokee, explaining how the legal system works, helping them, do all that. Georgia then makes it illegal for those preachers to be able to do that. And when that happens, we have a court case, goes to the Supreme Court, and eventually, they're told that Georgia has to allow the people to go into Cherokee's land, that the Cherokee actually do own that land. And so we see that the Supreme Court even is coming in on the side of Native Americans. Now, everything goes to the Supreme Court. John Marshall presides over this case. The Cherokee are desperately trying to hold on to their land. They're saying we did everything we should have done. We have treaties that say this land should be ours. Georgia is trying to take the land from us. They're putting restrictions on who can come into our land. They're saying all of that is wrong. It makes it to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall, the guy that gave us judicial review. I mean, this is just a judiciary titan. Rules that the Cherokees clearly had a nation, right? They have their own government with defined boundaries. And a treaty where the American government recognizes that the land that they're in, that's in large part in Georgia, is the Cherokees, and that Georgia can't interfere with that. And so the Supreme Court. So I mean, when we try to say, oh, all Americans are against the Native Americans, well, clearly not. I mean, one entire branch of our government has sided with natives. Now, it's not going to be enough, and it's not going to be enough very specifically because Andrew Jackson doesn't care. Remember from the previous lecture, can anybody tell Jackson what to do or challenge his authority? No, he just can't tolerate that. And so what happens is we see a breakdown in democracy, right? We see a breakdown in the checks and balances and separation of powers. Jackson essentially, looks at this as, no, I'm for removal policy. And if you tell me I can't remove these natives, he essentially looks at the Supreme Court and says, try to enforce it. I'm the president. I have a military. Does the Supreme Court have a military? No. Supreme Court doesn't enforce the law. As a matter of fact, Marbury versus Madison established that the judicial branch cannot force the president to enforce a law. And so Jackson just says, okay, you gave me your opinion. I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And tells the Cherokee that they've got to go. Essentially, we're going to see the Cherokee are going to try and renegotiate the contract. It's going to be a last minute thing where they're trying to renegotiate more money, and Jackson just gets fed up and says, "No, you got to go, and you got to go now." And that's when the military is going to come in. It's going to kick down the doors. The Cherokee aren't going to have time to sell their stuff. This is why it becomes so devastating. They don't have enough time to sell their land. The military just shows up, bayonets attached, and says, "You're leaving now." And then settlers can just come in and take their property. They're only going to be able to carry what valuables they can actually carry with them. So the Cherokee are wealthy compared to most other Native American tribes, right? They've been farming for a while. They're rich enough to own some slaves. I mean, they've got money, and after this they won't. And so they're going to be forced in a march called the Trail of Tears, where many of them will die. And so citizens of Georgia weren't supposed to enter Cherokee land without their permission, but Jackson just ignores it. Right, and then by 1838, the Van Buren is president. Jackson's out, but Van Buren is Jackson's like handpicked successor, and so Jackson just tells Van Buren how to handle this and says, "Hey, you got to get him out." Now, there are some historians that believe that Jackson may have handled this differently than Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren puts General Winfield Scott in charge. He's going to be like Civil War famous later. And it's kind of done as an afterthought. Van Buren's not as concerned about any of this, and so he's going to tell General Winfield Scott, "Get him out." Just send him out, and there's not going to be a lot of planning here, which is going to be disastrous for the Cherokee. The Cherokee are forced off their land. They're going to be sent on what is called the Trail of Tears. So the first thing that happens is, like I said before, military shows up at gunpoint, says, "You got to go. You can only take what you can carry with you. Let's go." The wealth of the Cherokee Nation was just wiped out. Their houses, their property, their slaves, all of that, settlers from Georgia are just going to run in and take it, because the Cherokee don't have time to sell it because they waited until the last minute. They didn't take that Indian removal money earlier. And so all of that wealth is gone. They're going to carry what gold, silver candlesticks, silverware, whatever valuables, whatever cash they can. They'll carry that with them. But literally, they're going to have to take that stuff and walk it all the way to, essentially Oklahoma. And so then they're not prepared for that yet. And so they round up all these Cherokee and put them in these makeshift concentration camps, about 17,000 of them. This is going to be pretty devastating for the Cherokee, because these concentration camps, they're going to be built by, the lowest bidder. The military's, in charge of paying for this stuff. They don't want to spend a lot of money on it. So it's just really not good quality stuff. We're going to see disease and sickness. And then, essentially at the exact wrong moment, they decide to leave and make the 800-mile journey where they're going to be walking it. They leave at the wrong time, and they're not going to be able to get where they're going before winter hits. And so nobody's really prepared. They don't have enough winter clothes, blankets, nothing like that. But what happens is they make this 800-mile journey, and there's thousands and thousands of them. As they go, they're going to have to stop and resupply at towns along the way. And every time that happens, there's this big mass of Native Americans outside, these towns. And the townspeople don't like that. They're kind of afraid. And what happens is, and it happens pretty consistently, is when, opportunists in those towns recognize there's an opportunity to make some money here. And they go out with, a lot of times with guns and weapons, and they say, "We don't want you here. We don't feel like we can protect you. But if you need stuff, if you want our protection to make sure that you don't, get robbed or whatever, you're going to have to pay us for that protection. If you want food, medicine, water, whatever, you're going to have to pay for that." And they make them pay, just absolute arm and a leg to be able to get supplies. And so essentially, as they go from town to town to town to town, each town kind of robs them. And so the Cherokee get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer and less equipped and less equipped. Now, the military is supposed to provide medicine, blankets, food, all that stuff. But we see the military is pretty corrupt here too. And so, the way that they do this, they do it like through private outfitters. And so if I'm the colonel in charge or whatever, I get, say I get $10,000 to buy meat. Well, what ends up happening is that I, as the military guy, figure out a way to kind of steal some money, and so I'll go and I'll buy the cheapest meat possible, the stuff like that's expired. Maybe it's got maggots. I mean, there's no food standards back then. I'll buy the absolute cheapest scraps possible. I'll not buy enough of it, and if they gave me $10,000 to buy meat, maybe I spend $6,000 on meat, and I put that other 4 grand in my pocket. People are going to do the same thing with medicine. The person in charge of buying medicine is going to pocket most of the money and buy either bad medicine or watered down medicine. Same thing with they're going to buy the cheapest blankets, and so the Cherokee are just, I mean, having an awful time of it. By the time they get through their 800-mile journey, somewhere between 4 and 8,000 are dead. That's a huge number, and that's a huge discrepancy between 4 and 8,000, and we don't really know because as they're marching, the old and the very young die first, right? And so a lot of times there's not enough time to actually bury the dead. The military just keeps forcing this march, and so people just drop off along the way, and the military doesn't keep very serious records about it because they just don't really care. And so it ends up being this super devastating thing. Here's the map. We see it's not just the Cherokee that are being moved. You can see the Seminole are going to be removed right there. The Cherokee, who are right there in the Georgia, Alabama region. The Chickasaw, we're going to be moving all of them to that, that area in Arkansas, Oklahoma region. It's going to be devastating for these Native American tribes. These tribes don't always get along. They're going to be cramped and bad land. It's not a good thing, not a good look. And so yeah, that's it. That's Andrew Jackson and removal policy. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. We will go back to talking about Native Americans in future lectures, particularly in the 1960s when we start to talk about AIM and the American Indian movement. And kind of ways that they try to right these wrongs, and in some ways, Richard Nixon and the trying to make amends for some of these things that happen to Native Americans. Clearly can't ever totally make amends, but either way, thank you very much for your time. Have a good day, and I'll see you again shortly.